Okay, so I'm going to start and I'm going to actually read this to you. So it is perhaps fitting that I, as an English woman, bearing in mind my own traditional culture in which I have been educated, and within the tradition of Christianity in which I have also been educated, that I should perhaps try and explore with you some of the mystery of the images that I'm going to speak of today. So I'm going to explore today the attitude to the body as specifically seen in erotic sculpture from small terracotta images from as early as the 2nd century BC, some of which I have to thank Naman for giving me those images. And then we're going to look specifically at the great, more famous erotic sculpture from 10th, 11th, 12th century in the context of North India. Now, first of all, what is my definition of the body? My definition of the body, of course, as I've said there, is, of course, anatomy. But I also want to look at the body from the point of view of that hidden self. As the great Upanishad said so fittingly, subtler than the subtlest, greater than the greatest is the self, Atman, that is established here in the heart of a living being. Those are the great ancients, the great Upanishads, so ancient, so difficult to date, but goes back very early in time. The sense of our own awareness is part of our bodily perception. Your listening, my exploration inside my own mind, is part of what we call the consciousness of our developing awareness in our relationship with each other. And where India has taught me so much is that relationship in a relationship, the sense in which God is rooted in the crucible of our own bodies. It's something very different from the Christian tradition, where the soul is somehow yearning to return, but to a deity which is in the sky, in a sort of sense, in heaven. Of course, it's true that some say the great Puranas talk of the temple itself being the depiction of heaven, and these erotic images being what you would expect those delights to exist in heaven. But my interest is to look at this tradition that inspired India in around about 5th century AD. No one can date its origins, its roots. The great tradition of the agamas, the ritual texts, the great tradition of the Panchatantra, or the tantric system, that led to this perception of the inner body as a network of psychosexual energy rooted in the spinal column. And the aim of Tantrism is to transform these subtle energies into a permanent state of higher consciousness, ultimately immortality. And it's in that context that I'm going to be looking at sculptures like this, the great sculpture of the walls of the temples of Khajuraho, that's specifically the Kandariya Mahadeo temple, dated around 1030. And it's those particular, very subtle, very beautiful, we now say. But when we turn to what was the attitude of the West when they first saw these images, I wanted you to have the actual quote so that I could read it to you. This Captain Burt. In 1838, Captain Burt, who was one of Princep's roving engineers, having been, I might say, initially delighted by what he saw, had second thoughts. I found, he says, 7 Hindu temples, most beautifully and exquisitely carved. As to workmanship, but the sculptor had at times allowed his subject to grow a little warmer than any absolutely necessary for his doing. Indeed, some of the sculptures here were extremely indecent and offensive, which I was at first much surprised to find in temples that are professed to be erected for good purposes, and on account of religion. The palanquin bearers, this is the very interesting bit, the palanquin bearers, however, appeared to take great delight at those, to them, very agreeable novelties, which they took great care to point out to all present, which I think in that quote encapsulates the attitude of Victorian England in the 19th century, and indeed the attitude to those present, locals, who actually did delight in these images. They didn't have quite the problem that the British did. Indeed, what is very interesting, though, is that in the 18th century, there was a greater license in the study and the looking at erotic sculpture, partly because, of course, in classical Greece, you accept to have these very erotic images on the great vases of Greece. And indeed, as long as they looked at it in the context of classicism, it was okay. So at the beginning, as Bartemitta very beautifully describes in his book, Much Maligned Monsters, as long as they could describe the Hindu deities as satyrs or serpents in the classical world, it was okay. In the 19th century, much greater repression. Havel, with great perception, said in the early 20th century, he says, Indian artistic expression begins from a starting point far removed from the European. Only an infinitesimal number make any attempt to understand the philosophy, religion, mythological and historical ideas of which Indian art is the embodiment. And indeed, it is there that I stand, hopefully getting a little closer, thanks to the brilliance of scholarship, both in the study of archaeological material and people like Naman, who have taught me as much or more than I've taught him, and of course the great Sanskrit texts, which tell us so much about the perception of the people who actually were making these, and the acharyas and the brahmacharyas who actually instructed the sculptors to place them in specific places. Now we're going to start, I have to go fairly fast, I am aware, with the early 2nd century BC material, with the magico-protective, and we know that it was indeed that because we have ancient, again, Puranic and Shastric texts that refer to the magico-protective aspect of these erotic images, and of course the fertility aspect of these two. Secondly, I'm going to show you a few images that relate to the growing sensuality from the 1st, 2nd century AD. And lastly, we're going to look at the exacting tantric images that I've just shown you. Just to clarify, there are two different aspects to these erotic couples, or as they're known, mithuna, which is one on the right, and on the left, methuna. Methuna actually means very specific, very obviously direct coupling of images. This is one that I'm thankful to Naman for showing us. We have a tradition, even though we have very few monumental sacred sculptures from the 2nd century BC, we do have a tradition of these terracotta plaques which point to the existence of these loving couples and also the worship of the goddess, indicating certain aspects of fertility. Interestingly, also, we have in the Atharva Veda the mention of punch marks on the ears of cattle, which are these erotic couples, again indicating, implying the sense of fertility within the use of these couples. The idea of erotic, direct, overt, almost obscene images being generative is another aspect that we may be perceiving in these images. We have difficult to see in this relatively poor light, I have to say, but there are clearly indications of the man and woman with flowers, it seems, around their particular bodies. More easy to see are these images, again, thanks to Naman, these three here, very overt Methuna, Shunga images, again, around about the 2nd century BC. This idea of Ashlila, the obscenity, generative of a certain power and fertility. Also, very overt coitus with animals. Again, this is something taboo. So we're seeing the expressions of something taboo and yet indeed maybe generative. From the 1st, 2nd century AD, we have a growing sensuality with the impact and influence from the kingdom on the northwest frontier with the establishment of Alexander, who left this Greco-Bactrian community in the northwest, where they begin to grow wine, and some of the aspects of the worship of Dionysus enters India from the northwest. We have the growing sense and evidence of images like that, a more bacchanalian examples as we see in those images. From the 5th to the 10th century, we have the beginnings of, again, the regeneration of these protective images. There's Mithuna couples on the left, that on the cave temples, of Buddhist cave temples indeed, in the ceiling at Ajanta, and on the right, again in the ceiling, these protective images, protecting sometimes thresholds or doorways. Again, this sense of the apotropaic, the warding off of evil spirits. Nama mentioned the importance of demon and the spirit world, something we are not familiar with here in the West. The idea that surrounding us are demons that we must protect ourselves from. Part of the reasons why in the temples there are very few open spaces. Not only open doorways and windows in the temple, but openings within our own bodies. Our mouths, our eyes. I've heard that the eyes are something you have to be very careful of. The openings in the eyes, receiving germs through the eyes. Every part of our orifice is a dangerous place, a transition indeed. And we have evidence from the texts that we look for the suggestions of this protection. For example, the Agni Purana suggests that the doors should be protected from such imagery. The Brihat Samhita, which is dated around about the 6th century AD, ordains that Mithunas, together with creepers, ganas, little dwarfs, and swastikas, should decorate the temple door. And we can see the loving couples that go around the door of that Gupta temple of around the 5th century AD. Feudal courts grew in wealth and sophistication. These royal kings, particularly in groups like the Chandalas in northwest India, are increasingly interested in literature, court dramas. Within their literary tradition, there is an intentional double meaning, sandhya bhasha, and also punning, slisha, and an interest in the glorification of bhoga or pleasure, seen, I'm sure everyone is aware, in the great works like the Kama Sutra. Some Puranic texts, as I've said, refer to the temples as depicting heaven on earth, but some other Sanskrit texts refer to more complex mystical diagrams that I'm going to show you today. So the temples we're going to look at are, for example, the 9th century temple in Ostian, Rajasthan, the Satyamata temple, and then we're going to look specifically at the Lakshmana, Vishwanatha, and the Kandariya Mahadev at Khajuraho, and briefly at the Rajarajani temple in Orissa and Bhubaneswar. This is an example of the small type of image, which often protects the doorway. They're relatively small in scale. Although they exist in many temples, they are not of the large scale of what we will see in Khajuraho. Here in Orissa, again, relatively small scale. And what is significant is if you look at the one on the left, she's hiding her face. That suggests that to the people who created them, there was an attitude of disapproval. So even within the context of the sculptor, there is a sense of dialogue with the image. Then this is the Lakshmana. This is the temple that has been notorious in the West and given India a reputation for the creation of this kind of imagery. Very specific, very detailed. What do we see here? Obviously, perhaps obscene images, images of bestiality, images of that particular woman having whatever you can see. I won't have to describe. Again, my own slightly embarrassed view of expressing it. But indeed, this is very specific. We are grateful, I have to say, to the very thorough work on these temples by Devangana Desai, who is responsible for, despite the initial attitude that these temples represent a very extreme sect called the Kola or Kapalika sect, that indeed they represent a more conservative sect of tantric practice, inspired and inspiring the great courts of the Chandalas. And the reason that she says this is that she says that these are commentaries. For example, she refers to, on this wall here, this particular image here with a man in congress with a horse. Again, if you notice, the figure behind is hiding his face. So again, we have a dialogue. But we're also fortunate in having an actual name underneath this particular frieze. And that is the name identified as Sri Sadanandi Kanaka, which was the name of the character in Krishna Misra's play. And this is what has given Devangana Desai the view that this is indeed commentary, both on the sects, on the Jains and Buddhists, and making commentaries on the more extreme practitioners of tantric sects at that time. And these are the kind of images that inspired Captain Burt, or perhaps shocked Captain Burt. But indeed, the kind of beauty and sensuality that we've seen developing from the 2nd century AD in India really comes to extraordinary pass in these particular images. Naman has spoken about it. It will appear in his lecture. But here we do not just see images to inspire us, to delight us, because Bhoga was one of the inspirations of these images. But we see a much, much more complex and interesting, hidden message if we look at this particular grouping here. And that message is related in this particular diagram, which is the sect from the 12th century in Kashmir, who talk about and refer to the use of visual or yantra diagrams, and of course mantras. They refine and spiritualize. What I'm going to talk about is a much more physical substratum of the practice of this tantric sex or sexual image or sexual energies. And in the 12th century, this, in a way, refinement of these ideas brings it internal into our own self, so that the female in the spine and the male in the head becomes internalized. What we have very grateful for is the existence of a text called the Shilpa Prakasha, which is a 9th to 12th century work on temple architecture, compiled by an author named Ramachandra Kulachara. Kulachara, his surname, identifies him as a tantra practitioner from Orissa. This manual has been vital for informing us of the hidden message of these great sculptures. For example, I'll read to you. The evil spirits will flee far away at mere sight of the yantra. In the best temples dedicated to Shakti and to Rudra, this yantra must certainly be placed. Then the monument will stand unmoved forever. This yantra is utterly secret. It should not be shown to everyone. For this reason, a love scene had to be carved on the lines of this yantra. The Kama Bandha is placed there to give delight to people. Interestingly, you see that palanquin bearers gave them delight. But you can see the relationship between the abstract yantra, which involves very precise meditation on mantras, yantras, and extreme hatha yoga, in the way in which it became refined by the 12th century in terms of practice. But of course, what interests me is that there is an earlier tradition or substratum of this more refined Sri Vidya tradition. And that was Kola practice, the more extreme left-handed tantrism. When I looked at that image that you showed us of Chamunda, and you looked at the extremity of energy of this extraordinary hair and the veins on that figure, we can see the extremity of those particular atmosphere and time. And it is within the context of that extremity that we have to see the initiation through yoginis of a time when the substratum was more involved with the literal or metaphorical transmission and transformation of substances, of body fluids. I haven't got the time, I'm afraid, to go into these particular fluids, but I will show you this. This is an image on the side of the temple in Orissa, and it shows the man drinking from the vulva of this particular woman on the side of the temple in Orissa. This transmission, this initiation from the woman to the man, where the man becomes recipient of what comes from the woman. Now, it may indeed be metaphorical. It may be all a metaphor for what is internalized. It may indeed, the woman may be an expression outwardly of what is internal within man himself. But once he absorbs, that is what the texts say, the earlier text, he absorbs what he receives from the woman. And that substance he then transforms through his own hatha yoga, his own intensive practice, through the kundalini, through the spine, into the center of his mind, behind the third eye. That is the place of the transformation and the realization of this permanent state of higher consciousness. So, going to the end of my talk, Isabel, I'm sure you'll be glad to hear, modern man no longer believes in the efficacy of auspicious images of any kind, erotic or otherwise. This skepticism leads to refusal to see sex as beautiful, although I think we in this room do not, or that the images could ward off the danger of unwanted spirits. And this is just a list of the many layered possibilities of the interpretation to erotic sculpture. The overlaying is what India is so famous for. Overlaying in terms of punning, sophisticated language within the courts, the medieval courts, overlaying in terms of this inclusivity that I've expressed to you. And finally, in my conclusion, I say, to understand the significance and meaning of the Mithuna and Methuna images requires, in today's audience, an openness to layers of meaning, pun, and an acceptance of the juxtaposition of the obscene and the sublime. With today's scholarship, we are on one level closer to understanding the purpose of the imagery for those that made it, due to the study of archaeology and the ancient texts. However, we can never wholly understand the mystery of these images. We might grasp the propitious generative qualities of the act of lovemaking, delight in the sensual, or even understand the fear of the spirit world from which they sought protection. However, it is much more difficult for us to understand the intention of the complex sexo-yogic tantric imagery from the great monuments in Orissa or Central Asia. Here, secrecy was the aim of the craftsman. He chose to portray a sensual image which would delight and thereby distract the uninitiated from the hidden spiritual formulae. These images reveal a concern with the direct realization of supreme consciousness of the spirit body and thereby immortality. Tantrism encouraged the practitioner to channel energies in the crucible of his own body through an intense practice of hatha yoga and the use of sound and mystical diagrams. This method followed an earlier belief in a literal or metaphorical alchemical transformation of substances and energies. To understand erotic sculpture involves not just the ability to read the relevant texts or the imagery, but to directly experience and envision this inside oneself. Hinduism teaches the West not to turn our eyes to heaven to search for God, but to look and listen to our own bodies and inside the silent places of our minds. If this is possible, what the sculpture reveals would be sensed, the invisible seen, unity experienced. One must disassociate sin from sexuality and see rather that bhoga, enjoyment, is a form of yoga union. In other words, the dissolution of the boundaries between the phenomenal and the numinous in the experience of the bliss of sexual union.